Raul Smith here with a special announcement. Over the course of the next 2 months, we will be posting regular posts on sports.theclosingtag.com to kind of give you my thoughts on each individual team in both the NFL and the NBA. Just kind of giving you my overview thoughts on exactly where I think each team is going, what I think each team needs to do to improve, and kind of giving you my overall thoughts on, how their season's going to turn out. Spoiler alert, I think we may be in for some history in the NFL, history in the making. But with all that said, now you may enjoy the rest of the episode. Following is a Galactic Digital Studios production. This is Sports Central, part of the Closing Tag Network. So a lot of crazy stuff's going on right now in the world of sports, and not the least among the craziness going on is the NBA free agency. And there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of confusion going on as to what exactly the fuck is going on. And I, as the resident NBA fan of the Closing Tag Network, am here to explain all of it to you fine folks. This is Sports Central, part of the Closing Tag Network, and we will not be getting into the Olympics because I honestly haven't had much of a chance to really catch what's going on right now. I'm not going to get into the contract extensions of Tua or Jordan Love in the NFL. I'm not going to get into Russell Wilson already crashing and burning in Pittsburgh. Wow, who could have seen that coming? We're not going to get into the Lakers trying to land that one last big fish named Jonas Valanciunas. Yeah. If your biggest free agent aspiration is Jonas Valanciunas, you have failed. Just saying. None of that. We're not diving into any of that right now. We're not diving into the Lauri Markkanen trade rumors either. So that's for another topic and another time. I'm probably not going to even touch Lauri Markkanen until something actually happens. Because right now, everything that you hear and see on social media and in the media and on ESPN and everything is all hearsay. That's all it is. So, pushing all of that aside, we're solely focusing on why everything's so crazy right now in the NBA. So, let's rewind the clock back a couple years. So the NBA salary cap was very simple, I guess you could say. It's not as simple as the NFL's, where it's like, here's how much money you're allowed to spend, and you cannot go over, period. You have to let someone go if you go over. It will not let you spend more money than what's allotted, period. That's called a hard cap. The NBA has always operated on something that's called a soft cap. Now, what that means is, yes, we're telling you how much money you have to spend on players. But it's a little deeper than that. You can go over the cap with varying degrees of penalties. So first and foremost, there is a floor. There's a salary floor. And each NBA team is required to spend a certain amount of money per year on player salaries. And if they don't, then they're penalized. Basically, they have to front the remainder amount plus interest to the NBA office until they meet that floor. Philadelphia was in danger of meeting the floor, but Paul George kind of fixed that. So there you go. And then you have your soft cap. That's how much money technically you're allowed to spend on players, which at this point is kind of a joke because, almost every team these days is above that cap. So you have your soft cap, and then you have what's called a luxury tax threshold. The luxury tax threshold, basically, if you go over the luxury tax, you're not only paying players for that specific threshold, but you're also paying interest to the NBA office. You're fined a dollar for dollar amount for going over the luxury tax. So let's take, for instance, the Golden State Warriors from back in 2017. They were over the threshold by about, I'd say, $32 million. So they were essentially paying $64 million for being that far over the luxury tax. In addition, you're restricted trade-wise. You have to bring in roughly about the same salary that you're sending out in trade. Now, under the old collective bargaining agreement from 2 years ago, you would be allowed to bundle a bunch of players to make that salary work. And that's a key distinction that I will get back to here in a minute, I promise. You can bundle a bunch of players and, say, go after a Donovan Mitchell, or go after a LeBron James, or go after a Jason Tatum. You can do that under the old rule. But you have to match the salaries within, I think it was like 150%, something like that. And you can also match draft picks. You can throw in, trade cash considerations, all sorts of things. That was the old salary cap back in 2022, 2023, something like that. Starting this year, the NBA is working under a completely different set of rules. And once you hear all the stuff that is in the new collective bargaining agreement, you will understand why teams are desperate to try and trade and try and maneuver as far down below what's called the second apron as much as possible. So your salary floor still stays. Your soft cap still stays. And you're still restricted in some ways in regards to trades. And then you have your luxury tax, which again still stands. Here is where it gets complicated. And I was going to make a blog about this on sports.theclosingtag.com, but I figured it was probably going to start sounding word for word, and I was probably going to be hit with plagiarism, which would be bad. So I'm just going to do an audio pod here and now about this. So here we go. You have your cap. You have your luxury tax threshold. But above the luxury tax threshold, you have what's called a first apron and a second apron. Now, the first apron, teams that exceed the first apron are subject to a smaller set of restrictions. This is all off Google, by the way. For example, they can't acquire players via sign and trade, use more than the taxpayer portion of the mid-level exception. That's a key distinction. Keep that in mind. Or use any portion of the biannual exception. Again, big point there. They're also limited to matching salaries in trades at 100% of their outgoing money and can't sign players waived during the regular season if their salary exceeds that year's mid-level exception. So, basically boiling it down, if a team breaches that first apron, which I think is like $10 million a year above the luxury tax, which is, considering NBA contracts these days, is insanely narrow. Basically, you can't sign anybody using the bi-level exception. You can't use more than the taxpayer portion of your mid-level exception. So the mid-level exception basically allows teams to sign players for roughly $5 or $10 million a year, even though they're above the salary cap, and potentially even above the luxury tax. What the first apron is telling you is you can't use more than the taxpayer portion of that mid-level. So if the mid-level exception is about $10 million, then the taxpayer portion of that is $5 million. Consider this. $5 million a year in the NBA might land you someone that's going to be coming in for 5 or 10 minutes a game. It's not going to land you a superstar. It's not going to land you hardly anybody that's worth noting. I mean, maybe Contavious Caldwell-Pope. I don't know why I just butchered his name just now. Contavious Caldwell-Pope. There we go. You can't use it on someone like that because they're going to be signing somewhere else that has the cap room that is going to give him 15, 20 million. That's just how it is. And you can't acquire via sign and trade. Now, sign and trade is huge because sign and trade is how a lot of these free agent moves over the last month have gone down. Klay Thompson, that was a sign and trade. Chris Dunn to the Clippers, that was a sign and trade. By the way, how insane is it that Russell Westbrook has now been traded to the Utah Jazz twice and has been released almost immediately both times? And both times were to help out an LA team. Yeah. Buddy Hield going to the Warriors. That was a sign and trade. DeMar DeRozan going to Sacramento. That was a sign and trade. Paul Pierce, that was more of a, hey, you've got cap room. I want money. Grab. And remember how I said that there was a little bit of leeway with trading players that match salaries? That leeway is gone. You now have to match penny for penny what's coming in with what's going out. Can't do any, finagling about that. You have to match salaries penny for penny if you go over the first apron. You can still trade 6 players for 1. That's not really much of an issue, but here's where it gets crazy. I mentioned there's a second apron. Yeah. Here we go with this shit. Teams that finish the season with a payroll over the second apron, which is $17.5 million above the luxury tax threshold, which again, considering NBA contracts these days, is a very narrow margin for error. Face a long list of roster building restrictions. These restrictions are as follows. You can't use the mid-level exception. Period. You can't trade multiple players in the same deal. So if you want to grab a Anthony Davis, or if you want to grab a Lauri Markkanen, or if you want to grab a, just throwing names out there, Joel Embiid, you cannot trade half your roster for them. You have to go 1-for-1. Period. You can't sign and trade your own players to acquire others. So all this talk about, Klay Thompson going to the Mavericks, or, Buddy Hield going to the Warriors. The teams that were trading those guys, if they went over the second apron, can't do that anymore. You cannot do that anymore. You have to lose them. You have to let them go. Can't send cash in trades. And I made the joke a couple of episodes ago about cash considerations being one of my favorite trade acquisitions in the NBA, because here we are in 2024 and we're still using cash in trades. The Russell Westbrook trade that I mentioned, going to the Jazz for Chris Dunn. Cash considerations was involved. That cash is now going to be used by the Utah Jazz as part of this downtown renovation project, which includes the Delta Center. So that's huge. If you go over the second apron, you can't do that anymore. If you go over the second apron, you can't aggregate contracts in a trade. That's kind of what I mentioned before with the 6 players for 1 type of thing. Has to be 1v1, and you have to do 1v1 per team. You can't, do 3-team trades. You can't do 2-for-2 or 3-for-3. It has to be 1v1, and only one team is involved, period. You can't take back more incoming money than outgoing in a trade. Again, going back to the very narrow margin for error that is included in the first apron. You can't sign players whose contracts were bought out by a former team. So let's take again Russell Westbrook. For example, Russell Westbrook was traded from the Clippers to the Jazz in the Chris Dunn deal. The Jazz almost immediately waived him out. Basically, bought his contract out. Now, if the Denver Nuggets, who ended up getting Westbrook, were above the second apron, they could not sign Russell Westbrook to a contract. Period. Same thing with Ben Simmons. Ben Simmons, if he were to get bought out, then teams like the Lakers or whoever is on the precipice of that second apron can no longer buy or sign Ben Simmons to a contract. It's just not happening. And here's the thing. Here's the kicker. Here's the reason why teams are finagling and maneuvering and doing everything they can to stay under that second apron. If you finish the 2024-2025 season above that second apron, your 2031, 2032 first round draft picks are frozen. You cannot use them in trades. Not now, not ever. I mentioned several times in blogs on sports.theclosingtag.com when I was doing the If I Were the GM series on all 30 teams, that first round draft picks in trades are like gold. And if you can't use your first round pick in a trade to try and grab a superstar player, at this point, you're basically fucked. That That is why teams are going as crazy as they are right now to try and go under the cap. It has gotten so insane and it has gotten so out of control that LeBron James, Mr. I want to be an NBA owner one day, had to take a pay cut. Granted, a less than $5 million a year pay cut, but semantics, we'll leave that alone. He had to take a pay cut so the Lakers wouldn't go above that second apron, because they were that close to going over. That is how insane things have gotten in the NBA. Now, the only two teams that are frankly at the risk of going over that second apron by the end of the season at this point are the Phoenix Suns and the Minnesota Timberwolves. You can take a wild guess as to why that is. Yeah. Phoenix kind of screwed themselves, to be perfectly honest. And to be frank, I think Minnesota has too. But I can see where Minnesota's trying to, work things out. Here's the crazy thing about Minnesota. They're going through an ownership transition. They don't know who they're selling the team to just yet. But the old owner, I forget the guy's name, was going to sell the team to an investment group that was headed by former Yankees player Alex Rodriguez. Yes, that Alex Rodriguez. But surprise, surprise, A-Rod decided to back out. So now they're kind of in scramble mode, trying to figure out what's going on. Going over the second apron for an NBA team is going to be a lot harder to sell to potential buyers than not. Yeah. But again, I can see where Minnesota's trying to, build a contender and whatnot. Right now, I believe the only player from the previous year, from last year's team, that is taking a pay cut is Mike Conley. And I commend Mike Conley, for looking out for the team first. That was his whole reasoning for taking a pay cut. He wants to make sure that Minnesota is, going to be okay. But guys like Karl Anthony Towns, guys like Rudy Gobert, guys like Anthony Edwards, guys like Jaden McDaniels, guys like Naz Reid are all going to see a significant bump in salary this coming season. That's going to hurt Minnesota badly. That is why you're hearing a lot of rumors right now about Karl Anthony Towns potentially getting traded. It's not because they don't like him. It's not because he is a terrible teammate or a terrible player. It's not like he's not getting along with Rudy Gobert. It's not like he's completely disregarding the rise of Anthony Edwards or anything like that. It is simply a financial thing. Karl Anthony Towns is set to make over $40 million this year alone. Yeah. And that's just 1 year. He's still got, I think, 2 or 3 years left on his contract after 2025. So the fact of the matter is that Minnesota is pretty much fucked financially. Now, I believe there was another thing, but Google's not telling me it, but it was basically if a team goes over the cap or over that second apron, I think it was like 4 years in a row or something like that. They end up losing. No, not losing, sorry. They end up having their first round pick bumped all the way to the bottom. So let's say, for instance, this expansion that the NBA has been talking about for months on end ends up happening within that 4 years. So let's say Seattle and Vegas are back in the NBA. Well, Seattle's back. Vegas is coming in. Yeah. So let's say, for instance, expansion happens. That means regardless of where the Minnesota Timberwolves land from 1 to 32, their pick will end up going all the way down to 32. Assuming, of course, Phoenix doesn't beat them to the punch. That's nuts. That is insane. And as we noticed with, previous drafts, no names mentioned, the 2024 NBA draft, having a pick in the top 10 versus having a pick at the very bottom of the first round is like night and day. Now, Minnesota probably will not be hurting too much because, again, they're trying to build a win now team. And they're doing it by, drafting and then promoting from within, except for the Rudy Gobert part. But with Phoenix is in much worse shape because of the whole situation with KD and Bradley Beal and Devin Booker. Phoenix is in a really bad spot right now. Now, the one silver lining in all of this is that I believe Kevin Durant's contract runs out, maybe not this coming season, but the next season. So that's $50 million a year coming off their books. That's huge, especially if they want to keep their draft pick kind of in that same 1 through 10 range, because I don't suspect Phoenix is going to be around much longer as far as where they're at now. I just don't. Too many teams in the West are improving. Too many teams in the West are rising up the ranks and are going to probably pass Phoenix up. And I just don't think Phoenix is built for long term. I just don't. I'm still not convinced Bradley Beal and Devin Booker can work on the same team at the same time. I'm still not convinced Kevin Durant is 100% physically healthy. I mean, a torn Achilles will do that to you. Just ask Dominique Wilkins. And I don't suspect that Phoenix, as is currently constructed in the front office, knows how to draft well. So, could I see Phoenix? Could I see Phoenix basically, shooting themselves in the foot? Yes and no. Granted, they won't be able to trade their 2031 first round pick because I don't know anybody that's going to want to trade with them right now. And especially a 1v1 trade. Maybe Brooklyn decides, hey, here's Ben Simmons, dead contract. Here you go. We'll take Bradley Beal off your hands. And then they have 2 expiring contracts over the next 3 years. They could do something like that. I don't see it happening, but they could. And I don't know if anybody's going to want to trade for Karl Anthony Towns 1v1. I just don't see it happening. There's a lot of restrictions going on right now in the NBA. There's a lot of, craziness going on right now. And I don't know Well, here's the thing. I don't know who all is above that second threshold or who all is um okay, so we can add one more team to that uh list right now, and that is Milwaukee. Milwaukee is basically kind of on that precipice of the second apron. And yeah, looks like the Clippers. How are the Clippers above the second apron? That is wild. The Golden State Warriors are above the second apron. Okay, this was 2023, 2024. Okay, give me a minute to read all this stuff here. Okay, so okay, so Boston, I can see happening. I can see Boston being above the second apron, mostly because of the recent contract extensions for both Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. But again, as I stated before, that was well worth it because I don't know if Boston wins that championship without them. I don't know if Boston wins the championship without Derek White. Derek White's going to get paid. So you got 3 big-time contracts right there. I don't see Boston, going under the second apron. I just don't. Denver is apparently above the second apron now. After, dealing for Russell Westbrook. How the fuck is Detroit above the first apron? What the hell? Milwaukee's above the second apron, which, again, not surprised. Phoenix, that can't be surprising. Wow, apparently Minnesota is not above the second apron. I stand corrected. So apparently, according to Bobby Marks, who is an expert on this sort of thing in the NBA, he states here that certain teams can, declare ahead of time that this is our hard cap and we're not going to go above it regardless. No matter what, we're not going to go above this. And they can set that hard cap pretty much anywhere under the second apron. But because certain teams have declared that they're not going to go above, a certain threshold between the soft cap and the second apron, they now legally cannot spend more money than that. And I think certain teams like the Jazz and the Chicago Bulls and teams that basically don't have a lot of players that are making insane amounts of money, those teams are probably not going to have too much trouble staying under that hard cap. There's a lot of craziness. I know I say that a lot, but I don't know how else you can describe it. It is insanity. Okay, here we go. SportingNews.com has all of the financials listed out. So here you go. Salary cap is set at $136 million, which, if you really think about it, is a lot of money. But consider that most superstars nowadays make more than $40 million a year. It's going to be almost impossible to build a championship team in the NBA on less than $136 million. That's just the reality of it. The luxury tax threshold is $165 million. The first apron was $172 million. And the second apron was $182.5. Now you notice that gap between the first and second apron is like paper thin compared to the salary cap versus the luxury tax. I mean, only $10 million separates the first and second aprons. I'm trying to see if there is a listing of what teams are going to be above. Here we go. Okay, so the following teams are above the second apron regardless. Okay, Minnesota is above the second apron. I must have been looking at last year's numbers then when I saw that. But right now, Phoenix is far and away spending more money than anybody else in the NBA. $226,186,537. I'll give you three guesses as to where the majority of that money is going to. Yeah, that is $37 million above the second apron, more than anybody else in the entire league. That's nuts. And they're probably not even going to make the playoffs outright this year. I'll have predictions probably sometime in September. But I just don't see Phoenix as an outright playoff team. Play-in? Probably. Playoff? Maybe not. One team that I think will make the playoffs is number 2, Minnesota, spending $205,991,718, which is $17 million above the second apron. Again, all those contract extensions that are kicking in that I mentioned are what's killing them right now. Boston at number 3, $196,574,991, which is $7 million above the second apron. Again, well deserved for Tatum and Brown, but that is going to kick Boston in the ass. Almost a guarantee. Milwaukee at number 4, $195,430,637, which comes out to $6.5 million above the second apron. Milwaukee's pretty much fucked. The Lakers at number 5 at $188,885, $188,885,999, which is a grand total of $45,001 under the second apron. Thank you, LeBron. I won't bore you with all the numbers, but number 6, Miami, number 7, Denver, number 8, Philadelphia, number 9 is where we start seeing teams under that first apron. So the top 8 spending teams in the league are not allowed to basically bundle players in trades. are not allowed to sign players more than the taxpayer portion of the mid-level exception, are not allowed to use the biannual exception under any circumstances. So that's it. That's ball game for those 8. And then you've got Dallas at 9, Golden State at 10. Golden State's under the first apron. So that's pretty cool. New York at 11, which shocks the hell out of me. Atlanta at 12, New Orleans at 13, the Clippers at 14. That's a little bit more like it. That's a little bit more in line with what my understanding was. Now, here's the craziness. The Clippers are actually under the luxury tax. So, all things considered, they're actually doing really well. Let's see. So, I'm just kind of reading up notes here. Brooklyn at 15, which I suspect they'll go down much further after this season because of certain players that I've ranted on in the past. Yeah. Indiana 16, Sacramento 17, Washington 18. Washington at 18. Portland at 19, Chicago at 20, Houston 21. I believe that is where, close enough anyway, to where the salary cap teams are, or the soft cap teams are. So Houston at 21, Toronto 22, Memphis at 23 is interesting because Memphis, for all intents and purposes, should be on its way back up once John Morant gets healthy. John Morant is going to get healthy probably within the next month. So that's something to keep an eye on. Cleveland at 24 is very surprising, especially considering the contract extension they just gave Donovan Mitchell. That is interesting. That is something to keep an eye on. They're still under the cap. So they could still theoretically go get somebody in free agency. So that Jonas Valanciunas thing that I was talking about earlier with the Lakers, Jonas Valanciunas could very easily turn around and go, well, there's this other team that wants me that is probably closer to winning a championship than you losers are, so I'll sign with them instead. Oklahoma City at 25, $5 million under the cap. Just throwing that out there. Charlotte at 26, Orlando at 27. I'm a little surprised Orlando's still as far under the cap as they are. San Antonio at 28. And they're probably a play-in team today. I know I'm probably giving Chris Paul too much credit, but consider his track record. He went to Oklahoma City. They became a playoff team. He went to Houston. They practically almost were on the verge of becoming a championship contender. He goes to Phoenix. They're a playoff team. He ends up leaving Phoenix. They're no longer a playoff team. The one team that, is kind of the exception to the rule, ironically enough, the last one he was on was Golden State. Detroit at 29, the Utah Jazz spending the least amount of money at $111 million. Really? Really? And people wonder why no one wants to sign with the Jazz. Oh, by the way, how's all that big name fishing or big name hunting that Danny Ainge was so braggadociously talking about during the draft? How's that going for you? Yeah. Yeah. On that note, it's 45 minutes now, and I think I've talked long enough. So, if you would like to donate, I'm not going to bother trying to ask for $1 million. Yeah. But anyway, donation link is in the upper right hand corner of the closingtag.com. You know what to do from there. If you are interested, or I've been screwing this part up for the last 3 episodes. Wow. If you're listening to this on Spotify, leave a review. I'm going to close this window before shit gets crazy. There we go. If you are watching this on Facebook, like the video, like the page. I would love to see those follow and like numbers going up. Share the video with friends. Comment below. What are your thoughts on all the insanity going on with the NBA and with the first apron and the second apron? Is it as convoluted for you as it is for me? Because it's pretty goddamn complicated for me. If you're watching this on YouTube, same drill applies. Comment below. Like the video. Like the channel. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. That way, you're notified every time a new video or reel drops. Again, I get that screwed up. It's shorts on YouTube. I know. I'm calling them reels because they're reels on Facebook. And it's the first place I post these videos to anyway. So there you go. Yeah. Thank you for liking, for listening, for downloading, for donating, for doing everything you can to help support this fun little endeavor that I absolutely love to do. And I'm not being facetious when I say that either. I'm being very sincere about this. Your efforts are not going unnoticed. So thank you. There may or may not be a lull period. I'm just giving you a heads up right now. It all depends on what happens this week as far as stuff in my life is concerned. So I'm just giving you a fair warning now. Okay? Thank you. And until next time, remember to include your closing tags. Thank you. This has been a Galactic Digital Studios production.